evening and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This program focuses on interactive debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans, and certainly looking at some of the global dominant trends in the international community. In his epic poem, Divine Comedy, which took approximately 12 years to write, Dante Alighieri stated, "In the middle of our life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood where the straight road has been lost." Have South Africans lost the road? Has 24 years of constitutional democracy failed us? And has the ANC gutted the very values and principles encapsulated in our constitution? That's our discussion and debate for tonight. Well, joining me in the studios, I'm joined by Professor George Devenish, Professor Emeritus at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Welcome, Professor. It's been good to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start off with you, Professor. The current constitution that came into South Africa in force in February 1997 essentially encapsulates a lot of the values and the principles by which the country is now supposed to be governed. You yourself were in fact involved in the initial drafting of the interim constitution.
Correct.
Tell us the process that went into that, and in fact some of the challenges that were faced back at that stage during the process of transition.
Well, one must remember that it was Mr. Mandela who in 1986 initiated talks with the then apartheid National Party government. As a matter of fact, Mandela got very ill. He had tuberculosis. He was moved to hospital and he was visited by the then Minister of Justice, Kobie Coetzee. And they had a conversation. And both of them realized that South Africa had reached a stalemate. The military could contain the incipient insurrection in the townships. Sad to say, the trauma and tragedy of South Africa at that time was that the townships were on fire and young men, white men, were conscripted to control this incipient insurrection. Mandela and Coetzee had a discussion, and that was followed by subsequent meetings. Mandela realized that the liberation struggle could not overcome the military in South Africa, and the military realized that they could not subdue the liberation struggle, and that a different path had to be sought.
I want to explore that with you, Professor, because already, and many people are not aware of this, we talk about the historical negotiations, that took place at CODESA, but prior to that, the talk goes on, and maybe this has kind of been swept under the carpet. Between 1987 and 1990, for example, there was talk that a lot of the ANC officials, for example, led by the then subsequent President Mbeki, and then of course at the time the Mandela regime, Deputy President Mbeki,
Correct.
in fact met with members of the Afrikaner elite, the Broederbond, in England. And at that particular meeting, there were certain historical compromises that were essentially made prior to what happened at CODESA in 1990. In fact, I've got a report by journalist John Pulger who stated that so secret were these convivial meetings that none but a select few in the ANC knew about them. The prime movers were those who had profited from apartheid, such as the British mining giant Consolidated Goldfields, Anglo-American and so on. And in a sense, some would argue that certain historical compromises took place then, which have had severe ramifications for what we now experience 24 years later.
I think that is correct to a certain extent. Those compromises were explored. They were not actually accepted. Mandela made it quite clear that while he was in prison, he could not actually negotiate. And those who were overseas were in an exploratory situation. So I don't think the compromises as such were reached during that period.
Well, there were just two on that point. I don't want to break your thought on that point, but if you look at the fact when he stepped out, and we remember that I was still a 10-year-old boy in 1990, he stepped out on the balcony of Cape Town City Hall. Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president, was with him.
Correct, yeah.
And he addressed obviously millions of South Africans. The point he made at that particular juncture, and this is the quotation given to him, was that moral power, the power of justice, could triumph over anything, which was obviously clear. But what it was important, he stated, is now is the time to intensify the struggle. And obviously he was elaborating, for example, on things like nationalization of basic services, healthcare, mining, banks. And the next day, for example, there seemed to have been, or the forthcoming weeks, a subsequent retreat. There will be no public ownership of mines, banks, rapacious monopoly industries, no economic democracy. And he had pledged with the words, a kind of a change or modification of our views in this regard is, which he initially stated was inconceivable, seemed to have basically occurred. So what I see is a kind of the economic apartheid, in a sense, continued after 1990 and of course 1994.
Well, you know, I don't think that occurred instantaneously. Mandela did make those statements at his famous speech at the Cape Parade Centre, but it wasn't the next day that he recanted. And you must remember that Mandela always stressed that he was part of a collective. And after his release, he began a dialogue within his own party, you see, with those who'd been overseas, and then with members in the civil society and big business. And ultimately, as a result of a process, and it's interesting that in relation to nationalization, I understood that he made a statement after his visit to Davos at that time, which is actually occurring at the present time, in relation to nationalization. So what I want to stress is that there was a process going on all the time. You see, it wasn't something instantaneous. We also know that he met with the Brenthurst group, and that was essentially Anglo-American Harry Oppenheimer and Nicholas Oppenheimer.
But on that point, Professor, is that you, for example, had Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president, a lawyer by profession, and very much proactive in the trade union movement, for example, in the 80s, the state of emergency, 85, 86, 87, 88. Prior to 1990, 1991, 92, 93, 94, Anglo-American, for example, which by and large, in a sense, bankrolled apartheid, in a sense, co-opts this individual, Cyril Ramaphosa, and he then becomes the frontman of Anglo-apartheid. You then have, for example, a company called New Africa Investments buying Metropolitan Life, and within a decade, Ramaphosa becomes the deputy chairman of what was effectively a creation of apartheid. How do you explain the kind of schizophrenic relationship that a lot of these individuals had with power? It seems to be, in a sense, that a certain group of black elite were by and large co-opted by the very economic powerhouses that in fact bankrolled apartheid and continued apartheid by another name, democracy, or possibly a kind of a covert form of dictatorship, which was essentially a continuation of the old one, but obviously with the charade of essential freedom.
Well, you know, that's a very simplistic explanation.
Why do you say that?
It's far more complicated, because from 1990 until the acceptance of the interim constitution, a great deal of discussion and compromises were reached. And the important thing to realize is that compromises were made on both sides. The National Party also made very important compromises. The ANC also made important compromises. They realized that if we were to have a relatively peaceful transition, that each side needed one another. So that all these ideas, the nature of the economy, the political system, the liberal and social democracy which was to emerge, were a part of a historic compromise that was part of a process.
To what extent, Professor? To what extent?
Well, it was a compromise in the sense that each side had to make concessions.
Was there not more of a compromise on the part of the traditional liberation leaders or struggle, or in a sense, a lot of them were co-opted? For example, even if you look expanding on that, the TRC's commission, when business corporations were called to the conventional hearing, the institutional hearings were probably among some of the most important in this country. Yet all were basically in the end dismissed. Summarily so. You find, for example, a lot of these individuals, there was no reparations, just to come back and say, I'm sorry, or possibly just simply to confess. The people struggled who were at the end of this voracious and vicious enterprise still bore the brunt of their misery.
Well, I'm not going to talk essentially about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that unfortunately didn't do all the work it should have. But I'm talking about the actual political compromises that were reached at CODESA and the multi-party negotiating process, which reached its finality on the early hours of the morning on the 9th of December. And as a matter of fact, I sat next to Mr. Joe Slovo, who was the leader of the Communist Party, and we had very interesting discussions. And I'll give you some idea of how he thought. He said to me, Professor, I have come to the conclusion that South Africa cannot be run as a Marxist state.
That's what Joe Slovo told
He said to me that. He said that to me personally.
Was he embracing implicitly capitalism?
No. What he also said to me was that he had recently visited mainland China, and that the communist government of mainland China had discovered the mechanism of the market. And he said, we have to use that mechanism of the market to uplift and transform South Africa. But then he made a very interesting comment, and he said, I still believe in the moral superiority of socialism. And that was the compromise he reached in his mind. And I said to him, but Mr. Slovo, that is very interesting, because I, George Devenish, am a social democrat, and I also believe in the moral superiority of socialism. And I would like to see the kind of economic system that they have in the Scandinavian countries, where they have a welfare state, and where they look after people from the cradle to the grave. And I said, that's more or less what I would like. And you see, that was part of a continuing debate.
I just want you to hold on to that thought, Professor. We have to go for a quick ad break, and we'll be back shortly. back to I Beg to Differ, and my name is Yusuf Ismail, and with me in the studio is Professor George Devenish, Professor Emeritus at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we're discussing the particular role that the Constitution has to play in this country and whether South African political parties have failed to uphold the principles encapsulated in the particular Constitution.
Correct.
Just before we explore that and go into that, I want to take you onto this because it's important that when I asked you about the role or your role specifically in drafting the interim constitution, you were quite indeed prominent, and then you brought us back to what transpired in 85 and 86 and 87. 1990, for example, you had a situation where there were many, if I could call it, ANC pilgrimages to institutions like the World Bank and the IMF in Washington. We speak about the Davos, the presentations to Davos, the ingratiations at the G8, foreign advisors and consultants coming and going, pseudo-academic reports, the sort of jargon and acronyms that were basically taking place. Larry David, a comic writer, basically describes this as a babbling brook of bullshit engulfed the first ANC government, especially its finance ministries, in the sense that a lot of the advice that they received, a lot of the financial advisors that were on board that were encapsulated and embraced by the ANC leadership, in a sense, opened the broad ambit for a form of rapacious and vicious neoliberal capitalism to engulf the South African economy and essentially allow big business capital to take over to the extent that they've increased the chasm of wealth and poverty between the highest and the lowest, as was never ever before seen, even during the heights of apartheid. Would you see that as a reality?
Look, one must be realistic. When Mandela won the first election and became the president of South Africa, he had to take into account how he was going to govern South Africa, how he was going to maintain unity in the ANC, and he had to take into account the world situation,
The global economy.
and how we would function
But on that,
within that.
On that point, Professor, Africa analyst Peter Anders states that he presented an interesting view. He said, in respect of what you just mentioned, I think the ANC leadership at that time, during the Mandela administration, was ashamed that most of their people, that's African people, live in the third world. They don't like to think of themselves as being mostly an African-style economy. So, economic apartheid, this is what he says, has replaced legal apartheid with the same consequences for the same people, yet it is greeted as one of the greatest achievements in world history. Don't you see the cynicism in that?
Well, let us be realistic.
Okay.
We made a fundamental, paradigmatic political shift. There is no other example where a minority government, strongly in control of a country, actually gave up power to a majority. And that the constitution we got in the interim and final constitution got the theory right. We got a liberal and social democratic constitution in the final constitution, which made provision, besides the liberal and political rights, for the right of access to housing, the right of access to health, the right to education. So we got the theory right.
The theory was right.
Good. What we needed then was a process of transformation to take the 22 million African people who were living in dire poverty into the working class, and people from the working class into the middle class. And
that never happened, did it? That never really happened.
I want to make it quite clear. What we did get right We took a fair number of African people into the middle class. So today we find that the buying power of African people in the middle class exceeds white and other groups in that middle class. So that we did take a fair number, 2 or 3 million African people into the middle class. Where we failed, and failed abysmally, was to reduce the poverty of the extremely poor, those who live in the informal settlements, those that live in RDP houses. There are about 22 million people, according to the Institute of Race Relations, who live below the poverty datum line.
Look at the statistics. More black people die today than have ever died during the mortality rates amongst infants, the highest ever in this country. There's the chasm between the black elite and the black poor, highest ever in South African history. Crime rates, highest ever in South African history. Almost every single government department, notwithstanding, we had a discussion shortly back with one of the representatives who are challenging Eskom. Every single government department in this country infested, a cesspit, a sewers of corruption, one could say. If these so-called historical compromises never occurred, never took place, maybe there should have been some degree of bloodshedding at some early stage, or possibly they could have taken the about route where they nationalize mines, nationalize the public health care system. Wouldn't the situation have been far better than what it is today?
I don't think so. I don't think that nationalization or expropriation without any compensation has ever proved to be a successful economic formula. It's sad to say that we made reasonable progress under President Mandela and, with some exceptions, under President Mbeki. Unfortunately, Mbeki was wrong on the AIDS issue.
Sure.
And history is going to treat him very harshly.
It has already.
He should have made the antiretrovirals available at a much earlier stage. But in actual fact, one of the successes as a nation that we do have is that we have more people on the antiretrovirals, and that we've made great progress in that regard. Now, I also want to point out some other progress we have made. We have 17 million people on grants. At the time, in 1994, we probably had 2.5.
But that's also infested.
We've got 17 million.
Is infested with corruption. I mean, the amounts of money that people are earning through these grants are very much of a pittance. But I mean, that's another debate. I understand the point you're making in respect of that. The issue I have is that embracing hardcore capitalism, they embraced hardcore capitalism to its ultimate, to the extent that you have a foreign-owned multinational conglomerate coming over and literally taking over land, taking over the industry, taking over the economy. We see this with the Chinese, we've seen this with foreign European and American-based multinationals. Even, I mean, Eskom, for example, 17% of the electricity is being used by South Africans. About 83% is being used by multinational conglomerates who are based overseas with no returns inside this particular country. It seems that wherever you turn, wherever a South African turns, he's on the receiving end at the hands of rapacious capital on the one hand, and of course the rapacious machinations of the state on the other.
Well, you know, that is not the fault of the Constitution.
Absolutely, sure.
A great deal of what you say has occurred in the unfortunate period of the Zuma administration. Prior to 2008, our economy was growing at 5%. Unfortunately, it did tend to be a growth which did not bring sufficient jobs. But unfortunately, with the inception of the Zuma administration, virtually everything went wrong in government. The problems you are talking about could actually have been resolved if there had been the political will in relation to bringing about a greater economic equality. Now, at present, we have dangerous economic inequality, and that doesn't only apply to land, it applies to all resources. And in actual fact, in relation to land and other resources, the Zuma government, if it had been proactive, could have brought about regulation to diminish economic inequality. But unfortunately, the Zuma administration neglected all that.
Did we see, I don't know if this is probably putting it too harshly, but in a sense, an indirect collapse of the constitution during his administration?
No, most certainly I want to categorically state that the constitution has continued to work. And
but during his reign?
Even during his reign, because Zuma was challenged. The DA challenged Zuma prior to his election as president and continued to do so. And now, because that political party and also the EFF continued to insist that he be prosecuted for the 738 violations of various laws, that it continues. Also, we find the EFF insisted on its rights. So just recently, in a reported newspaper report, the EFF went to the High Court in South Gauteng, and ensured their rights, which were being frustrated by the ANC representatives on the Representative Council. And they wanted to boycott a meeting because they knew the EFF had a majority and would take over the Representative Council. And they went and they won their case. And they used the Constitution and they used the courts, which are inextricably part of the Constitution, to ensure their rights.
So effectively, then, Professor, it's not a collapse or a failure of the Constitution. It's a failure of the parties to uphold the values of the Constitution and being called to account accordingly, as they have been called by the opposition parties. I'm just being motioned we have to go for an ad break.
Yes, sure.
And when we come back, we'll discuss and continue this conversation. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and I'm your host Yusuf Ismail, and engaging in an interesting and fascinating conversation with my professor, or former professor, Professor George Devenish, Professor Emeritus at UKZN. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you.
Anyone who reads, and we've discussed a lot of things, anyone who reads the South African Constitution, as many of us have done, as I've done basically, would be foolish not to acknowledge that it is in fact a very progressive and it's a future-facing document. And in fact, elegantly written by some of the most best minds in our society. And I believe you were involved in the drafting of the interim constitution.
Interim, not the final.
Were you not involved in the drafting of the final?
No, definitely not.
But the interim constitution, in a sense, led up to the final constitution.
Well, what I can say is that the final constitution, to a lesser or greater extent, was based on the interim constitution, which was part of a political compromise, which was reached in the early hours of the morning of the 9th of December 1993.
So it kind of rushed.
No, I will not say it was entirely rushed, because we were at CODESA in 1992. That collapsed, but we did work, and at CODESA I was in working group 2, working on constitutional principles, including things like federation and unitary state. That collapsed. Then in 1993 we went back, and then we had the multi-party negotiating process, and we had an intense debate. And there were actually hundreds of people at CODESA and scores of committees. And they all had to be brought together, and compromises took place, and those compromises were brought about, and everything came together as a result of the efforts of Cyril Ramaphosa, Mac Maharaj, Ruth Meyer. They brought everything together, and it was an incredibly complex process.
Would you say that the process to a certain extent was not entirely independent because of these various role players and their influence, and each one wanting the trajectory in a particular fashion and direction?
Well, you know, that I have difficulty with that word independent, because everybody there came with their own ideas. As the interim constitution's technical committee, we got submissions from all the political parties, from the attorney's profession, the advocate's profession, and we then put together an interim constitution, which was a product of compromise.
So the constitution was a product of compromise.
Undoubtedly.
Did there have to be a Cosmas Desmond? I'm not so sure if you're familiar.
Yes, I know of him. A very great moral man.
He wrote The Discarded People.
Yes.
Fascinating story.
I'm aware of that. A morally courageous
individual,
Catholic priest.
I think he worked together with Dennis Hurley, and there
That's
was
right.
quite a nexus. But his point was that those historical compromises need not have been inevitable. That's a point he made in many of his workings. And this was way back in 97, 98, 99, when transition didn't bring, there were the kind of peripheral changes that people saw. But transition didn't actually bring true change to the economic lifestyles of many, with the exception of a select black elite.
Please notice that neither the interim or the final constitution has resolved all our problems. And I do not know what other compromise we could have reached. As George Washington said, in relation to the American Constitution of 1789, and that also involved a compromise. It was that compromise or no compromise at all.
What would have happened?
Well, we would then have continued with the ANC government trying to protect its turf using the military, and the National Party using its power of the military to contain, and the ANC continuing with the liberation struggle.
Wouldn't it have been too late for them? Because, don't you think that had the National Party been able to, at that late stage, consolidate its power, it would never have compromised in any event?
You know, the National Party was deeply divided.
Didn't they actually win at the end of the day?
Well, the Conservative Party were chasing them, and they were actually winning elections and by-elections.
Well, that's the point.
And then ultimately Mandela agreed to de Klerk having a referendum, because Mandela was a pragmatic politician, and he saw that de Klerk was losing support. He lost the by-election in Potchefstroom. And he said, we've got to strengthen de Klerk's hand. And although he was opposed to another white referendum, as a pragmatic politician, he agreed to it. And ultimately, that a political solution reached on the 9th of December, in my view, was the only one we could have reached.
But the political,
imperfect as it was.
This is the point which maybe I want you to maybe concede, or perhaps not. The political solution, in inverted commas, was reached, made primarily by concessions from Nelson Mandela on the terms of the National Party, not the other way around. Would I be correct in that?
No, I disagree with that. What I am saying is that both the ANC and the National Party made substantial compromises.
But look at the other way
and
around.
I'll give you an example too. Initially, the National Party wanted an entrenched government of national unity, so that even if the National Party lost the first election, the Constitution would guarantee indefinitely that a minority party would be in the executive. And de Klerk pushed hard for that. He also initially pushed for group rights. So they wanted an entrenched government of national unity. They wanted group rights. And Mandela and Mbeki said, no, under no circumstances. And there were huge fights and there were battles about that. But ultimately, de Klerk conceded that you would have the government of national unity only for 5 years. And he conceded that the Bill of Rights would be a Bill of Rights for individuals, and that groups would have no protection. They also reached a historic compromise on the nature of the state. Nelson Mandela wanted an entirely unitary state. He said, apartheid has kept us asunder. We don't want a federation, as they have in America. Buthelezi wanted a federation. He withdrew. He tried to collapse CODESA and the multi-party negotiating process because he wanted a federation. And he withdrew. And then ultimately, on this crucial question, the government of Germany said to Mandela, come and look at the federation we have got. And the Germans have a quasi-federation. It's only partly federation. And on that crucial question, we obtained the present constitution, which is not a federation along American lines or Australian or Canadian lines. It is only a partial federation.
So it's a partial federation.
Partial or quasi-federation, closest to the German, although not identical.
I want to bring you up to this. This is an article written by an African Cambridge scholar. This is what he says in relation to the Constitution, the final Constitution. He says, I often wonder whom was the Constitution written. Answers to this question vary depending on whom I ask. My middle-class colleagues are convinced that it was written for all the people of South Africa. But he goes on to say, many poor and mainly rural people with whom I interact think otherwise. To them, the Constitution was written by a select few to serve the needs and narrow interests of a privileged few. What's your response to that, Professor?
Well, I reject that entirely. And I want to make this clear, that while Mandela and Sisulu and all the great liberation movement leaders were negotiating the compromise, the ANC, as always, kept touch with its grassroots. It was having meetings all over the country in relation to members of the ANC in the remotest corners, and Mandela took those into account. The ANC is well known for this issue of keeping contact with its grassroots, many of whom were in the rural areas, many of whom were poor in the townships. And we underestimate the character and the efforts of Mandela in doing that.
Well, this is how the writer justifies, and I want to explore this and play the devil's advocate. He says, for example, in relation to the statement, he says, for example, for those who still struggle with the understanding of the true meaning of land ownership, here is a helpful paragraph from an essay titled The Agrarian Standard, written by a farmer and author of The Unsettling of America. He, for example, quotes, and he gives quotations, "How do we come at the value of a little land? We do so following the strand of agrarian thought by reference to the value of no land. Agrarians value land because somewhere back in the history of their consciousness is the memory of being landless. If you have no land, you have nothing, no food, no shelter, no warmth, no freedom, no life. If we remember this, we know that all economies begin to lie as soon as they assign a fixed value to land. People who have been landless know that land is invaluable. It is worth everything. Whatever the market may say, the worth of the land is what it always was. It was worth what food, clothing, shelter, freedom are worth. It is worth what life is worth. Under feudalism, the few who owned the land owned also by an inescapable political logic the people who worked the land. Our constitutional democracy has done very little to change this reality."
Once again, that is not the failure of the Constitution. It's even not the failure of the actual land reform policy. It is the failure of civil servants and politicians to make that land reform policy work and to extend it. Now, one of the great challenges that's going to face the new Ramaphosa government is the whole issue of land. And what we've got to do is we have to move rapidly but sensibly to bring about the end of the unequal distribution of land. Not just by ensuring that there are Africans who are the owners and farmers in relation to the land, but we have to do something for those who work for the farmer, the tenants. We've got to give them rights. We have to develop an imaginative and bold policy so that those who work the land, who are the poorest on the land, get rights in the land. And that is not impossible. Now, I'll give you an example.
I just want you to hold that thought.
I'll hold it.
We'll come back to that example. We're going for a quick ad break, and we'll continue this discussion when we're back. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ. We're in our final segment, and I'm in an enlightened conversation with Professor George Devenish. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you.
When we went on the break, just before we left, there was an example you gave, and you wanted to elaborate on the issue of land. What was the analogy you wanted to draw?
Well, press reports have informed us that in the Eastern Cape, as part of the land reform program, about 8 to 10 years ago, about 137 farms were allocated to emerging farmers. Recently, when a survey was done, it was found that only 10% of the 137 farms handed over to emerging farmers were actually operative.
So were the rest all stagnant?
The rest were standing stagnant.
Whose fault is this then
Now,
in the long term?
obviously
It's
the program and the Department of Agriculture, because it's no good just merely handing over land. What you have to ensure that those who farm the land have got access to finance. They must also have access to knowledge, extension systems. So they need a great deal of mentoring and assistance. And it's essential that the successful commercial farmers should be involved in mentoring them.
So there's no process of mentoring that occurs, and eventually you're going to have a situation where it's total disaster. The land becomes inarable. You can no longer farm on that land, and it's basically wasted land which would otherwise have been arable and contributed very much to the production in this country in terms of agriculture, food supply, and all the rest. But I don't want to digress.
Sorry, could I just interrupt? The program itself hasn't been entirely unsuccessful, but it has been largely unsuccessful. And it could have been successful if it had been more imaginatively designed and there had been more help for the farmers. And that's what we've got to do now. We've got to take the existing resources we have, which are mainly in relation to knowledge in the white commercial farmers, and AgriCorps SA has a program, and we have to end this unequal distribution of land by getting the cooperation of all in the interests of South Africa as a whole. And if we succeed and we move towards a more equal distribution, not only of land, but other resources, then we will have a more stable society. At present, unfortunately, the unequal distribution of resources makes us prone to a revolution.
Which is possible.
Which is possible. And if we want to move away from all the catastrophe that would bring, we must move in the direction of a greater equality of all resources.
More egalitarian society.
Correct.
I want to bring you something which may be close to your heart, the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
One of the critiques that I've seen by some jurists is that when you look at the Constitution, when you look, for example, at the Bill of Rights, a lot of the values, the principles encapsulating that, in a sense, derive from the Western philosophical background. And if you take, for example, Oriental cultures, if you take African cultures, the individual rights are not primary when contrasted with the community. So, for example, you've got rights of the community, concomitant rights, and of course social obligations. So there's obviously an emphasis of communal rights as opposed to the individual rights. Do you not see this in that circumstance as a superimposition of neoliberal or liberal Western values on African communities?
Well, as I've indicated to you, in relation to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that was decided ultimately with the final constitution by the Constitutional Assembly. And that Constitutional Assembly involved, once again, countless committees, and besides the 490 people in the Constitutional Committee, the Constitutional Assembly received 2 million submissions in writing from all parts of South Africa, so that the actual people and ordinary African people were involved in making submissions.
But how many of them actually read it or were told what it's all about? I mean, the issue of communal rights, it's missing.
Look, not entirely so, because if you go to Section 31, Section 31 protects the indigenous languages and customary law and the customary setup. And we still have respect given to the chiefs. Mandela created a national House of Chiefs. And with the exception of the Western Cape, there are provincial houses of chiefs. And their advice is sought. But they do not have the power to interrupt the democratic process.
2018 or 2019, the extremely high and astronomical crime rate in this country. Looking back, do you personally sometimes have regrets on the Makwanyana judgment?
I must be absolutely honest. No, I'm taking a controversial stand.
Snyman, for example, the jurist in criminal law, states that the Makwanyana judgment was a very poorly thought out judgment, strangely enough, in his introduction on criminal law, where he provides a very vicious critique on the judgment.
I am declaring my bias because prior to 1990, I was the local chairman of the Society for the Abolition of the Death Penalty, and under the old National Party, I strongly, with Bishop Hurley and other people here, and other people in South Africa, like Dennis Davis, opposed the death penalty. And that I believe that the Makwanyana judgment is an outstanding judgment, and it reflects my own thinking on the death penalty. But if you go and read the judgments of Langa, who became Pius Langa Chief Justice, and Yvonne Magoro, who became a Constitutional Court judge, and incidentally she was one of my students, and I'm very proud of that. She is a very great lady and a great judge. And they, in their judgments, brought in the whole issue of Ubuntu, and they used Ubuntu as a reason for why the death penalty should not apply in South Africa, and why the death penalty was contrary to the values in the Constitution. So I must respectfully disagree with Professor Snyman. And I have many...
It comes from an extremely right-wing perspective. Cut, sorry. Something wrong?
Yeah.
Shucks, man. Tell us. Sorry.
Sorry.
We've got 2 minutes left.
Okay, 2 minutes left. Okay, what did you record that?
Yeah, I've recorded.
You sure? You've captured that part?
Yeah.
Well, what part? Do I just... Okay. Okay.
Sorry if I went on
No,
too
that's
long.
fine. That's fine. Okay, so Professor, then on that point, you've displayed the inherent bias against the death penalty. But looking at the situation we are in now, do you not believe that certain exceptions should have been made?
No, I do not at all.
Well, technically, the death penalty still applies in case of treason. Would I be correct?
I think that is a matter of interpretation.
And hasn't yet been,
it's never
rectified.
been
It's a
used.
good point.
But I tend to think that the court may find that it is not. That is a moot point. And I can't give you any more information on that. But it is a moot point. But what I do want to say is that one of the reasons against the death penalty is that the research tends to indicate that the death penalty is not actually a deterrent. Now, we know, for instance, in the latter years of the apartheid regime, when the apartheid government each year was executing more and more people, the murder rate went up. One would have thought that they were executing more and more people, that the murder rate would have come down.
Comparatively, now the murder rate is higher than what it was pre-1994.
Most certainly.
What's the reasons for that?
You know, there are many, many reasons.
Failure of government, would that
You
be
see,
one
first of all, you must bear in mind that we have a very much larger population. We now have like 58, 59 million people. And in 1990, there were like 39 million. We have huge socio-economic problems. And I believe that the increase in the murder rate relates to the socio-economic problems that we have not tackled sufficiently aggressively, and that the death penalty is not a magic solution.
Last 40 seconds.
Yes.
Has the state or the government failed its people? Have they failed to uphold the values of the Constitution? And what does your magic ball, if one could call it that, chart the way forward out of this impasse that we've reached?
The Zuma administration, in operating the state, failed abysmally. We have the promise of a new dawn by Ramaphosa.
And do you believe that would happen?
It is difficult to predict entirely, but I have a measure of faith in President Ramaphosa, having seen him operate effectively at CODESA, at the multi-party negotiating process, and knowing something about him, and having watched in the last year, there has been a certain measure of progress. And this is the great challenge facing him and the other political parties as well.
Well, I want to thank you for those optimistic words, Professor Devonish. It's
Thank
been a
you
real
very much.
Privilege and pleasure to have you. We hope to have you again soon in the immediate future. And that's all we have for tonight, folks. So you've been watching I Beg to Differ. This is a program which focuses on contemporaneous debate, where we hope to get to the bottom of the story in unpacking corruption and other aspects that are happening and affecting us as South Africans. Till next week, this is Yusuf Ismail, phone on behalf of ITV. Greetings of peace, good evening, and have a safe journey if you're traveling.